Matt Bell is the author of the novel Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, as well as the short story collection A Tree or a Person or a Wall, a nonfiction book about the classic video game Baldur's Gate 2, and several other titles. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Tin House, Conjunctions, Fairy Tale Review, American Short Fiction, as well as many other publications. A native of Michigan, he teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. He will be joined tonight by Cecil Castellucci. Cecil is the award-winning and New York Times bestselling author of books and graphic novels for young children. They include Shade, The Changing Girl, Boyproof, The Plain Janes, The Year of the Beasts, among others. In 2015, she co-authored Star Wars Moving Target, a Princess Leia adventure. She is currently writing Batgirl for DC Comics. She is also a librettist and has an opera called The Language of Flowers opening up at the Tête-à-Tête Opera Festival in London coming up in August. Also joining us tonight is Brian Evenson. Brian is the author of over a dozen works of fiction. He has received 3 O. Henry Prizes for his work. The Song for the Unraveling of the World won a Shirley Jackson Award and was a finalist for both the Los Angeles Times Ray Bradbury Prize and the Balcones Fiction Prize. His most recent book is titled The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. City Lights will be actually hosting an event for him on Wednesday, August the 4th at 6 p.m. here on Zoom. Really hope you'll join us for that. Brian makes his home in Los Angeles and teaches at Cal Arts. So before we begin, I would like to let you know we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase books. We'll also be having a Q&A at the end of the evening, so please post your questions and comments in that same chat function. It is a great pleasure to have you all here gracing our virtual halls. Matt Bell, Cecil Castellucci, Brian Evenson, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks so much for having us. Cecil, Brian, thanks for being here with me. Thank you to everybody who's here. It's really great to see friends here. My parents are here, zooming in from a campsite in Michigan. So it's exciting to have them here. I think this is their chance to see me, so we'll try to do a good job. Cecil, Brian, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. So glad you're here. So everybody, what we're going to do tonight, maybe a couple of things first. If you want to talk in the chat while we're talking, that's fine with me. It won't bother me. I think feel free to like emote or ask questions early or be excited about something. I think that makes us feel like we're in front of real people. It's really nice to see your faces in this one instead of being a webinar. So feel free to use that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, and then we're going to read. Me and Cecil and Brian are going to read together and sort of do a little kind of performance-y thing, which I wanted to do at City Lights because the first time I ever read here, Peter made a shadow puppet play of my first novel. And so I read and he performed shadow puppets. And it was sort of maybe like the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm trying to live up to it. So we're going to try to do something performance-y tonight. Appleseed takes place over 1,000 years, begins in 1799 with a character named Chapman, who is a mythical retelling of Johnny Appleseed, as if he was a faun from Greek mythology. This begins, the second timeline is in 2079 or so, and follows a character named John, who is a scientist turned revolutionary, who is being sort of drawn into a plot to stop an attempt to geoengineer the stratosphere. Cecil is going to be John tonight. And then the third storyline takes place 700 years past our time on a glacial North America, where a character named C432, who is a bioengineered creature living alone in this compound on top of the glacier. And Brian's going to be reading his part. Cecil, Brian, should we dive in?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right. Thank you all so much. Chapman wakes in the cold and the dark and the wet pre-dawn slush to the sound of his brother Nathaniel, already up and tending to the sputtering ashes of last night's fire, cursing and shivering, huddled beneath his only blanket. Despite Nathaniel's ministrations, the coals beneath the ashes stay dead, the gathered wood wet, breakfast impossible. Shelling himself out from his bedroll, Chapman rises too, offering his brother a grunted good morning before stamping his cloven hooves against the frigid ground, trying to quicken blood sluggish with sleep. As first light breaks, he stalks silently away from their campsite, climbing the last ridgeline of this Pennsylvania mountain pass to watch the night's rainfall trickle off into morning mist, admiring the fine, accidental melody of clean water falling branch to branch. A moment later, dutiful Nathaniel follows along, dragging their bags and tools to where Chapman waits upon his outcropping of rock, one clawed hand raised to shield his golden eyes as he surveys the forest they'll cross today. Snowpack still jamming the forest shadows, sparkling ice coating its swampy glacial kettles and its irregular lakes. All this waiting glory, backlit now by a red shroud of sunrise, the new day's dawn setting aglow, a vast world not yet fully explored. This, brother, Nathaniel says, placing one calloused hand on taller Chapman's bare brown shoulder, waving the other out over the territory below. This is where we'll make our fortune.
John arrives at Yellowstone's Lamar Valley by noon, driving a browning landscape whose mountains no longer promise any hint of snowpack, only burnt trees cascading down the slopes. He parks his truck at the top of the narrow ridge, leaving the unmaintained park road to walk into the valley on foot, taking in the eerie near silence. No sound except the wind rustling dry plants, the river trickling down below. If only he could see that something of the wild majesty that had returned to this place. Some buffalo come back to these parklands emptied of people with the rest of the sacrifice. But when he scans the opposing bank's tree lines, his gaze meets not the bison he craves, but instead the narrow wedge of a wolf's curious face, impassively peering from the pines. John startles. He knows he shouldn't approach. The wolf's 100 meters away, atop a steep embankment on the opposite side of the river, but he can't help himself. How lonely he's been, how devastated he's become by his aloneness. Now his loneliness colors every empty landscape, anywhere once home to more bountiful life. He fords the river, splashing loudly, the wolf already backing away from the tree line.
C432 urges the translucent photovoltaic bubble forward with a thought, moving the craft out of the crawler's darkened hangar to drop onto the frozen crust of the ice. Once outside, he shields his eyes against the sunlight, its pale glow reflected and doubled by every meter of the monotonous landscape, the glittery white flatness stretching endlessly beneath the low blanket of the heavy white sky. All this whiteness, all he's ever known, his every remembered life having been lived upon this high glacial shelf. Its surface is shaped by precipitation and ablation, but underneath it's made of many frozen panes, shelves exerting incredible pressures against one another, a tectonics of ice causing stress fractures in sheer cleavings to continually open new crevasses to the air, their jagged breaks sometimes plummeting deep into the interior. 30 kilometers out from the crawler, an alert arrives from the bubble's sensor array. There's a newly opened crevasse several kilometers away, offering a possibly stable access. As the bubble closes the distance, C checks the remainder's memories, then scans the bubble's records of other descents in this area. Just because this crevasse opened recently doesn't mean there wasn't once another nearby, where some other C descended via some passage since collapsed. A new entrance to the below is a welcome discovery, but he can't afford to chance exploring some previously spelunked wreckage.
As many years as Chapman's made this passage out of Pennsylvania, the thrill of arriving in the territory has never ceased to provoke his fullest wonder. Propelled by joy, he runs dangerously this morning, his furred legs taking leaping, straining steps, his splayed hooves seeking purchase on sharp juttings of quivering rock, on old growth roots thrust through black earth and slushy snow, other obstacles threatening to trip him and send him sprawling. When his descent smooths onto more level ground, he increases his speed again, his few possessions banging rhythmically against his muscular torso as all around him the forest deepens. The sun has only a pale power beneath these trees, where the frontier's every shaded feature is a fresh barrier to progress. Searching for the way forward, Chapman follows a trail trampled by First Peoples or fur trappers or single file processions of deer, the path a barely visible scrawl plotting the way forward, then crosses dry strands of seasonal creeks strewn with the lacy bones of trout, an unremembered stream quickening with snowmelt. He encounters a thicket impassable except by hacking out each halting step with his tomahawk. He leaps fallen columns of oak and maple, vaults lichen-stung trunks, maybe giving shelter to squirming snakes, the only animals he can't abide. His movements scatter squirrels and chipmunks playing amid rotted leaves, forest mice leaping hungrily over melting snow. Once, an explosion of foxes appears, a half dozen pups running through the flattened grass of a meadow, once purpled with loosestrife, yellowed with goldenrod. In the moist underbrush, he spies the year's first warty toads, hopping hungrily through the moldings of mud rattlers and the pellets of horned owls. Abundance everywhere, everywhere gathering, and joy and predation and sorrow. Amid all this untamed splendor, every acre of forest is an empire in the shape of the world.
The wolf permits John's gaze, gazes back. Then it begins to nose through the grass at something. John at first can't quite see, then can't look away from. Surrounding the wolf are the corpses of dead bison, erratic boulders of shaggy fur. He counts a dozen giant bodies, then glimpses more hidden by the rustling grass. Here, a powerful leg ending in a strangely dainty hoof. There, a horn curving through the stalks. John carefully pushes back the grass to reveal the unbelievable bulk of an injured bison, a last juvenile, orphaned and alone. Its stout ribs pressing through stretched skin and matted fur, its bold shoulders too atrophied to lift its heavy skull. The wolf lingers nearby, stalking uncannily from corpse to corpse, nosing each of the dead bison in turn, sniffing and prodding, but not eating. Something's wrong, John realizes. A wolf alone wouldn't ordinarily pass up such an easy meal. He stands, determined to shoo it away from the juvenile, but as he rises, he hears, distant but closing fast, the telltale sound of approaching rotors.
C descends. Secure in his harness, he works the oversized buttons of the winch's control dongle, setting himself dropping steadily upon the cable, kicking his hooves gently against the crevasse wall. After he falls below the last of the sunlight, he allows himself a moment's blindness in the glacier's dark interior before he reaches up to click on his headlamp. His hooves continue their slow track down the near wall of the crevasse, even as the one behind him falls away, disappears into the dark. The winch's spool contains 500 meters of cable, but from his end, C can't measure how far he's dropped. In the lamp-lit crevasse, distance becomes ever more impossible to judge. Sight reduced to a single beam of light, sound to his scrabbling hooves on the rocky ice, the huffing echoes of his breathing, the free water coursing inside the glacier, its gurgling trickle moving below the frozen surface. He descends until the wall slopes suddenly away from him, leaving him dangling free, spinning in his harness straps. C panics, yelps out, the sound echoing off the invisible ice. With his free hand, he grips the cable until his harness stops spinning. Then he continues his descent, dropping meter by meter into the freezing unknown.
Wherever Chapman ventures next, there waits some unnamed waterway or unexplored meadow, some ridge never described, never made anyone's landmark. Or so he once believed, come late to this landscape, cleared of its most recent inhabitants. Now he just as frequently exits untouched woods to find newly planted lands, the forest brambles burned back, its glacier-spilled stones stacked into makeshift garden walls, so many trees felled to make rough sawn boards, boards nailed into unsound houses held upright by mortar and tar and hope. New construction makes Chapman nervous, long in habitation doubly so. From his youngest days, he could follow a wooded trail haphazardly stamped flat, but couldn't abide a road cleared by men with picks and shovels and mules. He could skirt the edges of farms, but couldn't cross their fenced-in fields without his skin aching with hives, his bones burning in their sockets. Only after Nathaniel hit on the idea of planting frontier orchards did Chapman begin to better acculturate himself, their nurseries tucked amid their wilder cousins, easing his flesh toward the idea of the domesticated. Nathaniel stands of apple trees, wild enough for Chapman to pass among them, as long as the trees are planted from seed and never grafted.
Above the ridge, a dozen drones fly. Heavy lifter quadcopters with bright yellow claws dangling underneath, arrayed in formation around a cargo drone the ungainly size of a dump truck. The noise is incredible. The downward thrust of the drone's rotors flattening the prairie to expose more corpses alongside the barely breathing juvenile and the improbably calm wolf. The heavy lifters descend, belly-mounted winches dropping claws on high-tension cables, their serrated jaws opening. One by one, they ferry the bison into the cargo drone's open hatch, its bulk swaying and dipping with each catch until one final drone lowers itself over the last living Yellowstone bison. John forces himself to watch. The juvenile bellows a sustained cry, guttural and grieving as it struggles against the steel claw. Its legs kick with late strength as it's lifted from the brown grass, its hooves running futilely on air until the drone deposits it amongst the mass dead of its herd. John hears the creaking cargo doors closing, then the heavy rushing wind of the drones turning in formation. Soon, the sky is empty, not even a cloud remaining to color the sunset. Once again, the voice of the world reduces to the howl of hot wind crossing the lonely expanse of the Lamar Valley, rasping the thrashed and flattened grasses where the bison lay down to die. Only the wolf remains, sitting on its haunches, staring at John, its expression blank, but its eyes alive, watching.
C's headlamp barely cuts the darkness, rendering everything a flat grayscale, except the occasional glimmering glitters of trapped particulate. Despite taking care, he finds the first sign of buried biomass, not with his eyes, but with his hooves, its surprise sending him tripping down the tunnel. He turns back to find a series of black roots wormed up from the floor, some as thick as his forearm, clutching in their wooden grips broken rocks and stuck gravel, captured dirt. It's not so much a tree as an inverted stump, but near it, C sees the sign of more buried wood, frozen hard as stone. To strike the ice is to court further danger, chancing the tunnel's cave-in, the collapse of the crevasse. But if C wants to go on, he needs to take as much of the buried tree with him as he can. The risk is enormous, but the possible reward great. If he can dig free this root ball, he can discover more tree beneath it, if he can extract it in its entirety back to the crawler. The roots are stubbornly resilient, surprisingly fragile. At first solidly stuck, then crumbling free. Every scrap is useful, every splinter worth retrieving. C removes a tarp from his backpack, loads whatever he can pry from the ice onto the plastic sheet. He hacks a depression around the root ball, unearthing more trunk farther down, more tree, possibly more trees. The glacier is capable of gathering anything in its path, and if it's gathered a forest.
By midday, Chapman reaches the river he seeks, the sun emerging over its clear, fast course, its waterline raised by snowmelt and spring rains. He squats over his hooves to scan the sparkling water for signs of trout coming up to feed on the gathering insects. Waiting for Nathaniel, Chapman swings his bag around his bare frame, rests it above his bony knees. He pulls it open even though he shouldn't. The seeds could easily dry out despite the moist pumice and pulp. And then he plunges his head into the bag's opening, breathes deep the wet ferment inside. Around him are 1,000 fresher scents, all the territory's perfumes and poisons, promises and provocations. But Chapman's favorite is the one he carries lashed to his chest, kept contained within his satchel. Not the attractive smell of apples ready to be picked, not the smell becoming taste of an apple bitten, but this rotten, stinking hope, the intoxicating promise of what next. The tree, the tree, the tree, taste and smell are almost the same sense, even in memory, even in dream. With his face buried in the leathern bag, Chapman imagines the taste smell of the apple, of the tree. He tells himself it's possible to plant, to grow, to harvest one glowing apple from. One apple, all he'll need to change his life. Let Nathaniel make his fortune if he can. All Chapman wants is one particular apple. Thank you very much.
Yay!
Yay.
See if I can get us all up on the screen.
All right. Cecil and Brian, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah. I feel like it's a sneaky trick to ask people to read your own prose back to you, so you can just be like, oh yeah, that sounds good when they read it, you know. Well, once in a while I was like, well, that's not too bad, that's great. So thank you so much for doing that.
I think it stitched together such great parts too. Like I think it really, you know, because it's all separate and they're paragraphs from different parts, but I think the way that you wove it together just speaks to the strength of the brilliant novel that you wrote.
Thank you, Cecil. I put it together in a thunderstorm in Michigan on the shore of Lake Huron, so I felt like that was an appropriate place to just, you know, do some alchemy. It was good.
Yeah, so this is a version you will only hear tonight, I think, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think it will. I mean, why improve? You know, it feels like we already did it. It's good.
Well, I would like to make a toast.
Oh,
I've poured myself a little martini here.
cheers. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Peter.
I mean, I found the book very exhilarating. I mean, the prose is exquisite. I mean, there is a lot going on, and I mean, on a lot of different levels. And I'm kind of reminded of the work of Donna Haraway, the creator of the Cyborg Manifesto. I mean, Haraway kind of criticizes the Anthropocene in the way that it kind of generalizes us as a species. I mean, and she also kind of explores the connections between kind of us and other living entities, kind of looking at maybe less human-centric points of view. I kind of feel that your novel sort of follows in the footsteps of her work and what she calls the kind of going with the trouble, kind of speculating about kind of novel relationships that humans may form with other forms of life, but also, you know, thinking about catastrophe, thinking about the, you know, climate change issue and more. I mean, does any of that resonate with you?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think so. The initial like idea that started the book off was to write this mythological retelling of Johnny Appleseed. So that was like the first idea, you know. And I think one of the things that sort of rippled through the book from that being the originating piece was that half human, half animal protagonist let you move between those spaces, and it suggested other places you can move between those spaces. I think I knew I was interested in not writing something, I mean, it's still pretty human-centric, but I think it's mad at itself for being human-centric, if that makes sense. Like, I think that I feel like there's parts of the book that are like, this is a bad idea. So I feel like it's at least critiquing itself for that, or knows that that's not great. And then I've always loved Haraway's, I mean, not always, since I've known it, I've loved Haraway's like phrase of staying with the trouble, which my creative writing students, some of them are here, probably heard me say in the classroom, just for the work that we do. You know, like to stay with the trouble of the story you're writing is also a way to get to it. But it has occurred to me that I think when I started writing this book, I was anxious about climate change in the way that you're anxious about when you don't go to the doctor when you're sick and you're like, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? But I don't really want to know. And I do kind of feel like I found out what was wrong with me by writing the book, or what was wrong with us maybe. And that the plot problems or the structural problems or character problems or language problems was also a way of like staying with the thinking, if that makes sense, or like to keep studying. That if I had wrote a book that I could write faster, I might have done less thinking about some of these things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cecil, Brian, does that seem like something in your work? There's like a similar, is there a mode like that?
sorry, I've never heard this thing, staying with the trouble, but I do feel like a lot of times, because I mean, just today I was having a complete crisis. That soggy middle where you're just like, wait, what did I do? Like, this makes no sense at all. And shit, I was supposed to hand this in yesterday and now I can't because I just threw everything out. But I do think that staying with the trouble and trying to like constantly ask yourself, like, what is the point of this page? What is the point of this scene? What is the point of that? And especially when you're dealing with something like climate change, which I am in my new book, is something to constantly be thinking about, because you're like, what's the real important thing here, you know?
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, I feel like my relation to writing about ecological stuff has changed over the years, and changed even as I've been writing over the last few years. And yeah, I do think there's something about engaging directly with these issues that ends up kind of changing the way you end up writing about them. And so I feel like I start writing in one way and then I kind of figure out where I'm going with it. And yeah, and there's something for me weirdly comforting about facing up to how bad things are.
Yeah, we were talking before we got on today. Brian was like, maybe you're more hopeful than I am. And I'm like, oh, like I'm a utopianist who doesn't believe it's going to work out, right? So like somewhere in between. But I do think I felt calmer as I wrote in a way that I like, the more I knew, I don't think I felt anxious. I maybe felt like I was facing it. So it didn't make me like everything's going to be fine. I did this research and I figured it out, and it's all going to be, if everybody just does what this book says, we'll be okay. But it did make me feel calmer in my life to be doing that work, and I think continuing to do it. Like I'm not done with it, you know. And I know Brian's new book that's coming out in a couple of weeks is like very ecological, and I think the stuff you're doing now is continuing in that way. Yeah, it's not to be finished with, but to continue that work feels good.
I wonder, Matt, if, you know, I'm so interested in the use of mythologies and sort of the stories that we tell that you have in your book. And I wonder if that's sort of also a place of solace, because I feel like we humans have been telling stories to try to make sense of the world and of, you know, things that we can't possibly understand. You know, why does this happen or whatever? And I found that to be very soothing in your story, because it's not just Johnny Appleseed. There's many other, you know, stories in there. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest reason is like those mythic retellings in the book are there because I like that stuff, right? You know, there's sort of like, there's just like a source of joy there. That's part of it. Like the reason the idea of writing Johnny Appleseed was attractive was because I loved that folktale as a kid, and the Disney cartoon of Johnny Appleseed that some of us may know that we watched on like bad copied VHSs like over and over as a kid. Like that stuff kind of sticks with me. But I think I do think there's something interesting about the like inexhaustibility of like myth and fairy tale. Like I feel like it's really hard to run down a fairy tale by retelling it. Like those building blocks seem like they can just be used over and over and over again without diminishing them. And that durability, I mean, I've never actually thought about it this way. That durability is attractive in a story about loss or about exhaustion or extinction. Like the durability of myth is maybe actually a really interesting foundation for that. See, so that's really smart. You should have written this book. That's a good idea. I think that's actually, I don't think I knew that until just now. I think that absolutely is maybe an animating force.
Great. You know, I think it's really beautiful. And I don't want to spoil what other sort of hints there are in there, because they're so wonderful when you kind of, you're like, oh, what? Like, really great.
Yeah. It's a way of expanding the timeline too, right? Like to go to, I think one of the central conceits of the book for me is that like climate change is not something that happens in like one place or one time. Like you can't, this is like Timothy Morton's idea of like the hyper object, that you can't know climate change by its sign in one location or one moment. It's sort of something that's dispersed in time and space. And myth feels like that to me too. Like there's something like about that, like a story, there's a story of Orpheus and Eurydice sort of pulled through the book, and that's also feels dispersed in time and space. That's not happening in one place. Like mythic time and linear time are different in some way, or story time is different, and that seemed interesting and fun to play with.
Well, there's something that happens near the end of the first section too, where there's a character who keeps on having to live the same experience over and over again until he's kind of made to exit that. And that for me really, made me think very much about mythic time and how that works as opposed to linear time.
Yeah.
And I think it also really gives you this beautiful way that you move thousands of years, it seems like, within one paragraph, you know what I mean? And like, it'll go from, and somehow it all makes sense because you've stitched in so well all of this mythology, and mythology is so from back then and also from tomorrow and of this moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I
think
teach
if I had something smart to say about that, I don't know if I do.
Just bravo on you.
All right. I mean, that part was so fun to write, right? The sort of the suspension of time. I mean,
yeah.
We talked about staying with the trouble as a way to like figure out the problems, but sometimes like you get the book done by finding games to play inside it, right? And you sort of find I remember writing that part, or the first draft of that. There's like a 5-page sentence where I'm trying to like hold time still and like make everything in the sentence happen at the same time. And like syntactically figuring out that was a blast. And it was like a thing that was really fun to do. And then later felt maybe like a weird litmus test when I talked to like editors and stuff. People were like, well, you can't do that. It's like, okay. It was actually like, it's useful sometimes to have like your weird thing where you're like, if someone tries to get me to get rid of this weird thing, I'm out, which is nice. And probably true of both of you as well. I think you have lots of your own weird things in your work.
Definitely happened, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I somehow I was thinking of your first book, and to me, it at the time, it really struck me as being like a very deep fever dream that had like threads going into other fever dreams. But this book seems more like taking a powerful hallucinogen that just like takes your consciousness and just sort of explodes it. What were your dreams like while you were writing this book?
I'm trying to think if there's anything like really good dream related here. I am like a kind of a vivid dreamer, I think generally, but I'm trying to think if there's like a specific thing that would come out of that. I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways, like I can tell when I'm not writing because my dreams will ramp up. Like there is a like getting it out during the day. The really boring thing I learned about being a writer for me, I don't know if this is true, or Cecil and Brian, but I'll bet there's something to it, is if I write a certain time of day every day, and if I get my work done, then I can like exist in the rest of the world kind of calmly and be present and be there. Like I write in the mornings and go teach, or I can answer email or run errands, whatever I have to do. And there is sort of a like, I get some of that out, the dream out, and then I'm like a calmer person. And when I don't write for like 5 days, then the dreams start ramping up and getting weird. And there's sort of like that stuff has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's kind of great if I can funnel it into the page, maybe.
Yeah, that happens to me. I have really intense dreams when I'm not writing, and yeah, so I feel like I have to write just so I won't go crazy.
Right.
I've had some solutions come to me in dreams too, where it's like I'm stressing out, I don't understand, I lost the plot or I lost the heart of the story, which is always so terrifying. And then I'll have like a simple dream and I'm like, oh yeah, that could work, and I'm like, oh thank gosh, you're doing it for me, like, it's still working. Good on you, brain.
Yeah, I have written stories that like started as dreams, or like there's some kind of central thing, but I can't think of something specific for this at this stage. Yeah. It's always one of the cruelties of publishing books is that by the time you do your live events for them, like the book, you finished the book like 18 months ago, and you're like, I totally would have been able to answer that question 3 years ago when the book was a pile no one should look at.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing I find, there's something really interesting about the book, which is that it on the one hand, it's like I can see aspects of earlier books of yours in it. So like myth is something that comes up in the house, and then I think I've said to you that Scrapper is so much about like exploring and collecting that I could see that as tied. But then there's also something very additive to this book. And to just give an example that won't give anything away, it's like, it's not only you're like, I'm going to retell the myth of Johnny Appleseed. You're like, and he's a fawn.
Right.
And so you have this thing that you add onto it that just is somewhat, it just moves it in a completely different space. And the whole book to me kind of feels like it's kind of operating in that mode in terms of just this thing that keeps on torquing us into a new place.
Yeah, I think so one of the things I think about a lot in writing is this Jane Smiley has an essay in her book, The 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, where it's called, the essay is the clock of the novel. She's just talking about all the like different discourses that might appear in a book, like gossip or travel or biography. But at the end of it, she kind of almost is like a toss-up idea. She says like, perfection is not like a requirement for writing a great book. Like some great books are perfect, but it's not a requirement for writing a great book. But all great books have incomprehensible abundance. I thought like, oh, that's the goal, like incomprehensible abundance. Like, let's just stuff the book, like put everything in the book. And one of the only ways I know to write a novel is to not save anything for later. Like everything I get interested in when I'm writing a book, I put in the book. Everything I'm like, oh, that's a great idea for a story. I'm like, I'll just put it in this novel. It'll be fine. I got kind of interested in this thing. Like it should go in here too. It takes so much to make a book go. Like, like the books where nothing else comes in die at 100 pages for me. And I'm like, I guess that's not a novel. But yeah, it's kind of like if you can stuff it with everything, that feels really great. And the other half of that, I think, is how I think about mystery, which is I was raised Catholic and was really sincerely religious for much of my early life. And there's sort of like the Catholic mysteries where the more you know these mysteries of the faith, the deeper they get. And that's kind of how I want mystery to work in a novel. I think that's the part of that I hold on to. I always feel where a novel's closing down and you're answering the questions, I'm looking for a way out of that. Like I want out of the trap of like the answered mystery. Like what's the mystery past the mystery? And if you can keep doing that, then the book feels really satisfying. It'd be awful to spend 2 years on a book and get to page 300 and be like, guess I figured it all out. Like the worst possible outcome. And that's the same in both of your work, I think, too. It sort of moves toward the mystery or toward the turn or toward the torque on the sort of story in that way. Do you find, is there like a reliable way for you to get there? Or do you feel like, is there a trap you try to stay out of as you're like answering the questions of your stories? Or is there something that you're like, oh no, I feel that happening. I've got to go somewhere else.
I feel like, Cecil, you can answer as well if you have something to say. I'll just make up something in the meantime. I do feel like there is something about if I know too much where I'm going with a piece, it's not interesting to me. It's like I might as well not write it. And so there has to be something about the mystery kind of being alive. And that for me is, I really hate like TV shows in which you have like the final episode that just solves all your problems and answers everything. And so I want to kind of leave things in my own work open. I like a certain amount of things solved, but enough open to feel like I'm still, the piece is still alive. I can keep on thinking about it.
Yeah, somehow you resolve and open, right? Like there's a weird turn.
It's a balance for sure.
No, yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I'm just sort of reflecting on the fact that I really want to write a novel again. Right now, I've been doing a lot of comics, and that has like different sort of problems because, you only have a certain amount of pages, so you can't like, you don't have time to kind of explore, let the story breathe. Like you gotta get it done. And so, but in that sense, I think it is really good training for, constantly leaving yourself threads to pull on, because when you're, when you're doing an ongoing series or whatever, like you always want to leave yourself something so that you can, if you get another 6 issues, you can pull on. And I always tell my students, because I'm sure your students are all the same, where they freak out because they've made a choice about something in the book, and then that closes all the other choices, and then they're totally frozen. And I try to remember that, like, I often think of like stories, kind of like, how Picasso had his blue period and he painted the same painting over and over and over again. And that we have these questions about these mysteries that we are interested in, and we poke at it from different angles. I'm going to poke it from this side, and I'm going to write a book about collecting or whatever, write about on this side. Okay, now it's going to be climate change. Now it's going to be this. Now it's going to be, whatever. And I think that that kind of gives you the freedom to let something resolve in the way that it wants to be resolved, without having to satisfy anybody else except for you as the author.
Yeah. I think one of the hardest things I see people writing their first novel struggle with is like wanting it to be like all the novels they'll ever write. You know, it's sort of this like, this is my shot. And so like the book is trying to be too many things. And I think like the deep relief of being like, oh, I'm gonna write like a body of work. And like the books will be in conversation with each other. And like there's always something you do badly or don't get done or you don't get to. I think I tell novel writing students, and like every book starts out being about 10 things. And then after like a draft, I'm like, oh, it's about these 5. And then after like a second draft, I'm like, it's about these 3. And at the end, I'm like, it's about this 1, and I didn't do it very well. And then I'm like, I guess I'm going to write another book. And like, if you got the 10 things in one book and you did them all perfectly, you would stop. And so like the joy is actually like, you don't get the thing done. But I do feel the way the books are in conversation with each other, and they clarify each other backwards too. There's the progress of like, you did this, then you did this, and then like you're building on something. But they definitely show me backwards what they're about. I think In the House feels more about some of the things I'm interested in now than it did when I wrote it. I mean, I haven't read it in a couple of years, so who knows, you know, but like in my mind, it feels more about like I was on this path then, and I didn't know it. And I think that would be clarifying going backwards. But that seems like a joy. What a great thing to find out that you write 10 books, like the books will talk to each other.
Yeah. Yeah. In a way, the problems for the current book are posed by the books that come before.
Yeah.
And that's, you don't know how to pose those problems until you've written the books that came before.
Yeah.
Have you all ever written a book that you've had to throw away? Like I wrote a book like 4 years ago that like nobody wanted, and you know I was like, well, I don't care, I'm going to write it anyway, and I just it was like I had to get it out of me as like a little palate cleanser, you know.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
I've definitely thrown stuff away.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. There's an expanding number of failed novels between every novel of mine, which feels like a terrifying algorithm to be in. Like between In the House and Scrapper, I wrote like 200-page novel starts that didn't turn out to be anything. And then between Scrapper and Appleseed, I wrote 4. And I'm like, oh, this is a bad path to be on. So I may have to write 8 novels before I write my next novel, and then 16. And then like, I mean, it really is pretty dark. This is the best my career is ever going to be right here. Like it's all downhill from here. So thanks. But it's I mean, so much stuff, right? And but none of those are waste either. I'm sure it's not even a palate cleanser. Like one of the novels I threw away or stopped writing is really what happened. I wrote like 100 pages of it. I worked on it for 10 months. And at the end of those 10 months, I'd researched my way into a spot where I was like, oh, this isn't a book I can write. Like even like the topic of it is like maybe not my topic. And I kind of learned my way into how complex the thing I was trying to write about was. And I was like, oh, I like am not like culturally going to be able to write this story. Like this is going to be a bad path. But I learned so much doing that. And it was also like, it still changed me. It still did the work you want writing a book to do to you. It just isn't going to be a book anyone ever reads. And that's different than like, was it a waste of time, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything from it that you may repurpose into, even if it's not that particular book? I mean, the novel that I threw away, there are like these 3 scenes in it where I'm just like, yep, I'm going to use those. Like, that, you know, they won't be this book and they won't be that story, but the bones of it were, you know, were something, you know? Yeah.
I wrote a like 60,000 words of a novel about Alan Turing once. I got really into Alan Turing. And that novel failed and fell apart. And the only thing that's ever come out of it is a 2-page story in Fairy Tale Review about the woman who did the dancing that they rotoscoped for Snow White, which does not seem like what you would get out of your Alan Turing novel. So a super, super long way around to a 2-page publication in my favorite magazine, right? Like
that's amazing.
Yeah, I wrote a book called The Open Curtain, and I had about 1,000 pages of drafts that I just had to discard that didn't work. And I think I got maybe 2 stories out of those 1,000 pages. But you wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't recognize that it came from there, but there was just a kernel of an idea that just stayed with me and that I could kind of use elsewhere. And that, I may do that just as a way of convincing myself that time wasn't wasted, but yeah.
I love Catherine Coldiron's like Brian worth those 1,000 pages. I love that book too. And you wrote that book's kind of in like 3 parts. And you wrote a different third part at one point, right?
I did that. That's the 1,000 pages is a whole different, 2 or 3 different versions of a third part that just never worked.
Yeah.
So it just killed me. So
yeah.
Mhm.
Writing is so
got some
fun. Everybody
questions.
should do it. I mean, it
That's
just seems
right.
like
Yeah.
a good way to use your time.
You guys will love it.
So we have some questions from the
Yeah,
audience
let's do
that
it.
are like piling up here. Let's see if we can get to some of them. It's kind of interesting. So we have a couple of people asking. We got B and Chris asking about the 3 timelines. Chris asks, I'm interested to know if any of the 3 timelines predated the others, or if they all wove together simultaneously, shaping each other.
I started with Chapman's timeline in 1799. It pretty quickly started wanting to be longer. I wrote a draft of the book where I thought the consciousness of the character would be like continuous through time, like it was like it was going to be like a 1,000-page novel about like one person doing a thing over time, and that was a really different version of the book. But I had pretty quickly, I realized I had like these 3 past, near future, future kind of things. The near future one took forever to figure out. I just couldn't get it. And I think some of that's because writing a near future timeline, the causality has to be more plausible. It's just harder. Like, oh, it's in the distant past, it's in the distant future. You can kind of just do whatever you want and get away with it. And you said the closer you set it to now, the harder it is to get it right. So I think that was the hardest one to do. The thing that really helped me was Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, which is about disaster capitalism. And it's all about people doing terrible things, which is like the war in Iraq lets Halliburton go in and like take over the rebuilding that country and make all this money and control all this land and power. And I tried to design a version of that where someone used it to try to get enough power to solve the climate crisis in like a techno-utopian way. And I could not figure out that timeline until I hit upon that idea. So if I hadn't read that Naomi Klein book, I'm not sure I could have got that timeline to work. But the other 2 are operating for like a long time, sort of in the way they are. And that one was just a mess. The early version of that book is just John wandering around the West by himself being like, it's really sad here, which was not super compelling.
So we have a comment and a question from Sangu. He loves your vegan food pics on Twitter and is curious if how veganism influenced your writing or vice versa, if the ecological research influenced your cooking and eating.
Yeah, I think so. I've been a vegetarian for 11 years now. I was the last person in my graduate cohort to become a vegetarian, so I think I was just pressured into it in grad school. But I have been for a long time, and initially started out as me trying not to eat factory farmed meat, which was what I was trying to avoid. And it was easier not to eat any meat than try to figure that out. And then at some point, 5 or 6 years later, I got interested just in agriculture generally, and was reading a lot about industrial agriculture. And the initial idea for this book came from a line in Michael Pollan's The Botany of Desire, where he talks about Johnny Appleseed and the domestication of the apple, and he calls Johnny Appleseed an American Dionysus. And I was like, oh, that's funny. Wouldn't that be fun to do in a more literal way? And that's how I got to this idea of this sort of faunish Chapman. So in one way, like in this very direct sort of, trying to be ethical about my food led me to this book in kind of a direct way. That said, Chapman is the only vegetarian protagonist I think I've ever written, even though all my novels were written by a vegetarian, which is weird. But the historical Johnny Appleseed was a vegetarian. And so it's just sort of, that's maybe one of the only historically accurate things about Johnny Appleseed in this book. Because he's afraid of snakes and he doesn't want to eat meat. But the rest of it is pretty much made up. So yeah, I think it is interestingly like an outcropping of becoming a vegetarian, maybe in my MFA program, and then continuing to try to think about how I eat has led me to these other questions. Yeah, thank you.
Let's see, Chad asks, Appleseed feels influenced by video game narratives. Can you speak to the way storytelling in video games influences your writing, if at all?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a super clear answer. I feel like it must. I play a lot of video games. I think about video games a lot. I wrote a book about video games. It must. But I don't know that I have a great answer. Cecil and I are both really into these like BioWare RPGs, like Dragon Age and Mass Effect and things like
Me
that.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe that's like a weird like bonding part of this panel. But when I was finishing Appleseed, at the end of a book, the only way I can keep a whole book in my head is to work super long hours, like so I can make a change on page 400 and know what it does on page 15. I have to like just jam the book in my head. And so I work like 10, 12-hour days, which I would not do any other time. And to unwind from that in Appleseed, I replayed the Mass Effect games. And it's interesting to sort of see how that might influence it. I don't think I have a super clear answer, but I will say in the book I'm writing now, I wrote a scene that I knew was a video game scene in a bad way. I felt the scene was static until the protagonist showed up. It was like people waiting. He like walked in the room or she walked in the room and then the AI activated. And I could feel that. And I was like, oh, like that's a mistake. That scene doesn't work right. These people aren't real. They're just like props that are waiting for this person to come up and give them life. So maybe sometimes I recognize in negative ways, but I don't know if I have a super clear answer. Brian or Cecil, do you have something you're like, oh, video games taught me how to do this?
Not really. I mean, I would say so. I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, and that taught me so much about world design and things like that. So more so than video games. But video games, I mean, I don't know. There's so much that's mood related in video games that's probably the most I've learned from. Is just
literally at my writing desk right now, right? I mean, like these things aren't wrong. You're not at hand.
No.
It's like thinking about branching narratives more, like having that sort of bravery to kind of jump around, and I don't know about you all, but I sometimes I don't like writing scenes, and so then I just go and write. Sometimes I don't like writing, but because I think I can't do it. But I do like writing the scene that I'm like, oh, I can't wait till I get there, and that's kind of like jumping to the part in the video game that you like, oh, that part is too hard for me that boss is too hard for me right now. So, but I know I'm gonna, especially if you're replaying a game, I can go here, and so I feel like and then the branching narratives, I think I feel like that probably. I'm going to say, Matt, it probably influenced your book, because I feel like with the 3 different timelines, and I feel like with comics, it's the same thing. It's really helpful to sort of think about, different alternatives that could happen, because especially when you're writing a story that you don't quite necessarily know what the end is going to be, to give yourself those options.
Yeah, I'll say, sorry, Brian, go ahead, please.
I was curious whether you had written all 3 of those lines simultaneously and kind of just ordered them as you went, or if you wrote them separately and then threaded them together.
So now the first draft of the book was real partial. And I think I wrote like a first draft until I hit the point where like, I knew I was no longer like, it wasn't going to be a thing, right? It was like, I figured out the book I was writing by writing a first draft. And then I stopped and wrote an outline as a plan for the second draft, which is my normal sort of move. Outline what I make and then revise the outline of that book into the better book I'm going to write next. And so the second draft tends to be the one that feels bookish. And so I wrote outlines that are pretty not right for the second draft. And then I wrote in like 30-page chunks, moving between the 3 timelines, knowing that it would not have 30-page chapters, but it was enough to like make progress without like forgetting that you're writing the other storylines. At the end, all the storylines kind of rushed to the end in like 70-page chapters, but it was pretty like 30-ish till the end. And then I had, then I took the 3 timelines, I ripped them apart and put them like just by themselves, and I rewrote each one. And they, at the time, they were like 60,000 words and 60,000 words and 40,000 words. So they were like kind of 3 books, and I revised those books, and then I rewove them in the way they are now in the book. Cool. Which was a lot of work, but I mean, I think that's the only way it could be done to some extent. Yeah.
I have a question for Brian here, from Chris. So I've mentioned to Matt earlier this week that I'm obsessed with your naming of the characters Gradus, Haupt, Villads, Esbjorn, Ger. Matt said he had some theories. Would Brian give us any inkling into the mystery of these names?
I'd probably rather hear Matt's theories about them, but I'm really attracted to Germanic and Northern European names, and I like the sounds of them. I also, a name like Esbjorn has a kind of meaning that's there, and then just the kind of hard sounds that you get from names like, names with G's, with K sounds and H sounds. So it's partly that, and it's partly that there's a kind of defamiliarization there. I mean, I think if my stories are being translated into Swedish, they should translate those names into like John and just common American names. But there is something about that kind of, for me as a writer of books, a space that feels slightly disoriented, that I feel like I can do my best kind of weirdness in. So.
Yeah. A mutual friend of ours, Michael Kimball, once pointed out to me in my own work, like that I lean toward the Germanic choice between Germanic and Latinate, and that you could edit by leaning harder. You like replace the Latin with the Germanic or vice versa and get to interesting places. And it does do weird things when you, or not weird, I mean, it's interesting. Like if you give up the half a language that's not that, or the bulk of English being, Germanic or Latinate, if you give that up. One of the most successful exercises I did in a sentence writing class I taught last year was to have students pick an origin space for like words in English. There's so many loan words in English. It's a colonial language and it's taking words from so many places. But if you lean into like all the words from one culture that appear in English, and then you write a story trying to only use those nouns or only use those verbs, you get in like a really weird space. Like it just has like, you can feel the subtraction of the rest of the language, and you end up in kind of an estranged, interesting place by itself. And you think differently when you write not with all of your language, and that feels interesting too.
Yeah, a writer that we
class.
Go ahead, sorry.
I want to take that class.
Right? It's fun.
Yeah. I was just thinking of Peter Marcus is someone who does that. Just limits the number of words he uses, the kinds of words he uses, and gets to really remarkable results as a result.
Yeah. Almost like something that's like its own language, right? And you've written about that a lot too. I mean, it's really impressive what Peter does.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Christina wants to know what y'all are reading right now.
Well, Appleseed.
Right. It's funny because I think one of the, I think you ask a favor of people and then they have to read your book so they can come and talk to you about it, but also like try to read back at everybody. So I have weirdly been reading Cecil and Brian this week, and Brian's new book's coming out. I've been reading that and reading other people that I've been in conversation with. I think what else I've read recently that I've been really excited about. I just reread, it's right behind me, so let me grab it. I just keep talking about this book because I feel like not enough people read it last year, but it came out last January. It's The Seep by Chana Porter. It's really great. The second time I've read it, it is like a benevolent alien invasion story. Like aliens show up and just kind of make everything great. And it's kind of the protagonist is like the one person who is dissatisfied with the utopia. And it's really fantastic. And I feel like it's doing the kind of speculative future thing we sometimes want like sci-fi to do, where it's like imagining a different way we could be living. And it's both like a kind of a post-climate, post-scarcity kind of novel, and also the person kind of like misses their old life a lot and causes trouble. And some of the things that are like good are irritating to my sensibilities anyway. Like there's a part where people do like really benevolent, kind community policing, and it makes you want to throttle the person. Like it's like, no, like that, I guess I don't want that either, maybe. It's a really great book. It's really short, it's really smart, it's well worth reading. The Seep by Chana Porter. It's great, absolutely worth checking out. And what a great cover too. Really beautiful book.
I'll mention, I'm reading a book called Chouette by Clara Ostrovsky, or Oshetsky, excuse me, which comes out in a little while, but it's about a mother who gives birth to an owl. And it's very strange and nicely done, and language is really great. It doesn't come out.
I felt the money leave my wallet when you said that. It was just like,
that's right. Yeah. But yeah, you know, as Cecil said, Appleseed has been a great read for me. I read a little book by an Indian writer named Gaurav Manga, which is called The English Teacher, teeny little book, which I really liked, prose fragments. I'll put it in the chat, the name of that book.
Cecil?
Oh gosh, well, I have when I'm in the middle of writing, it's very hard for me to like stuff my eyeballs with words. So, but I have over the pandemic, I have a books to film club where we read the book and then we watch the film. So up next on my docket is Remains of the Day, which I've never read.
Yeah.
Really excited about reading that. So I know that's not someone new, and everybody's probably already read it, but that's what I have up next on my thing.
It's a good one.
I was trying to type in the chat and I messed it up, but another thing I'm reading right now is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Crosby that came out maybe a week or two ago. It's a crime novel. It's really fantastic. It's like I'm listening to audiobook. The audiobook is extraordinary, and it's maybe the best crime novel I've read in a long time. So highly recommend that as well.
Matt, Cecil, and Brian, thank you all so much. This has been so much fun. And till the next time we see each other, here's a rain check for Vesuvios.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Peter, as always. It's so wonderful to be here with you all. Thank you, Cecil and Brian. Thanks everybody to be here. Really great to see so many people I love in the audience. Really nice for y'all to come out. So thank you very much.